Hey everyone. So in this video we're going to go over how to make this React to-do application work. So in the previous video we went over creating the components. So here we created 3 components. This is our main app component. It'll contain other components. So we created a to-do item component and a to-do input component. So these are the components here, but now we're going to make them actually work and create some state and pass in properties. So to give a little explanation here, this application is going to have a state that exists within this component. And basically the state will contain data so that when the data changes, React will automatically re-render the application. So for example, if in this app, if I clicked finish or if I clicked remove, what I'm doing is I'm not going to do any DOM manipulation. There will be an object here there will be a state variable that I can access, or an object, and then if I remove something from it or I add something to it, React within this render function, it'll call it again and re-render the application where it needs to. It won't re-render the whole thing, it'll re-render the parts that have changed. So in this case, if I remove something, here the to-do item, these items will be re-rendered because one item has been removed. And that's a great thing about React. I don't have to worry about the DOM manipulation or if I add or combining the data objects in JavaScript and somehow translating them into DOM elements and having both of them update at the same time. So to start working with state, we'll call this function getInitialState. And this is a function. And basically what this is doing, it's setting the initial state for when this app runs. So what we'll actually do here is, for this to-do container, we'll pass in an object and some initial elements. So we'll call it items, and we'll basically pass in an object. Within this object we'll have, let's just say, so we'll pass in an array of 3 items, let's say. So we have an array of 3 objects being passed in. So let's split this so we can see it. Okay. So here we're going to add in, we'll give an item, we'll have an item ID. So let's just say this is ID 1, and then the text will be make food. This will be ID 2, and this will be text go running. ID 3, text study for exam. So now, when this component is being rendered, let's actually drop this down here. To do items. Okay, so now we can see it better. So now what we're doing here is we're passing in items, which will be an array of 3 elements. So what we want to do now is somehow put these into the app right away when it starts. So getInitialState is going to take these items that we passed in. So it returns an object. This will be the state, return, and we'll say items is this props items. So props, so this will just refer to this component. Props and state. So state will be the object that stores the state of the component. Props are the properties that are being passed into it. So props is accessed by properties being passed into the component. So here we have to-do container. This property items is being passed into it. So we can access it within this component via this props. It's an object, so we have this props.items. So this props.items. So we'll leave that as it is for now, and then, so when we add a new item, we'll want to somehow, okay, we'll get to that later, the counterpart. So, okay, so we have this initial state, and now what we want to do is display each of these as list items. So right here, we'll actually, so let's do this. We'll do to-do item, and then we'll pass in item equals, item equals, so let's do items. So now we have, so we'll do this state items. So getInitialState returns state, and we can access it via this state. And its initial value items is set to the items being passed in, which is an array. So we'll set item equals this state items of 0. This will pass in the first item we have. So now we can scroll down into the to-do item component, and here I am an item. So we have this prop item is being passed into this component. And like I said before, within the component, you can access those properties being passed in. So all we have to do now is within brackets, we'll just do this props item. Item is equal to the first item that we're passing in here. And then when we get to the to-do item, we can just display it via this props item. And so now if we run this, oops, we got an error. I must have missed something. Hold on, this props item. Okay, so here we're passing in, so this state, we're passing in an object. So this state item 0, it's actually an object. So we want to pass in just the text portion of it. So now if we run it, yeah, okay, so now we got the, so make food. So just to clarify, this component is being rendered with these properties being passed in. So within this component, we can access these properties via this props items. So when this component is rendered, the state is set to items, and items contains an array of items. So what we're doing here is we're passing in the first item, just the text of it, we're passing it into the component to-do item. And then within to-do item, we're just displaying this props item. And then we get this. So what we want to do actually is display all of them. We want to loop through the items and display all of them. And so what we'll use here, and what's typically used when you're making a React application, is we'll use the map function. So right within the render function, we're going to create a new list. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this state items, and we're going to map it to return a new list. And so we'll use some ES6 syntax here. So we'll do item and then the index. And so now what we'll do here is the list will be a list of components to do item. And we're going to set some properties here. So key will equal item.id. So the reason we need a key is because when React is trying to re-render a component, it needs to make sure that, because we're going to be displaying several list items, React needs to keep track of what list items aren't duplicates and what list item went where. And that may be hard if there's no way to uniquely identify them. So the key property is sort of required when you're working with several elements of the same type. So here we just key equals item.id, and the ID is unique here as we when we created them. So key equals item.id, and then item equals, like we did before, item.text. And then that's all for now. So what we're doing here is we're mapping the state, which is an array, into to do item components. And that's stored in this variable list. And now what we can do here is just return list. So let's put this on one line. And so now if we run this, we get all the list items, and it's working great. So what we did basically is just loop through the state stored into a variable. This variable stores contains several to-do item components, and then we just return the component, all the components here. So now we have these 3 items, but nothing else works yet. So now let's start adding some functionality. So basically what we want to do is when you click on remove, it will remove this item. So like I said before, the state will exist within this to-do container. So when you click on remove, it'll call some function within here because we have to modify the state here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function here called remove item. Remove item, and then we're going to remove some item at an index. We'll pass in a parameter. So now what we're going to do here is we don't want to modify the state directly, so we're going to create a new array. So we have this array. So for example, when we start off, we have an array of three objects. When you click remove on one of them, this is index 0, this is index 1, this is index 2. When you click on one of them to remove, it'll return the item at that index. but we're not actually going to remove it. We're going to create a new array with that item not in it. So when you click remove item, what we want to do is var a this state items, and you want to filter. We're going to filter for all the objects in the array. We just want to exclude the index we're clicking remove at. So filter, we'll use some ES6 syntax here, vi, and then we'll do if I doesn't equal index, turn v. So here we have this new array that'll exclude the component where we clicked the remove button at that index. And now here's the React function that's important. We're going to set the state. We're going to reset it to a new value, and we're just going to set items to be this new array. So here we're filtering and removing the item at a specific index using the filter function, and then we're just going to set the state. And so what React does is when you set the state, it'll re-render the app. So now we have this function, but we want to pass this function down to this component here, so that when you click remove, when you click on this span remove, it'll call this function up here. So now what we're going to do is here, we're going to pass in, we're going to pass in this as a property. We're going to pass this function, remove item, as a property. So this remove item. So when you click on, here you'll be able to access this props remove item. And when you click on it, it'll call this remove item within this component. But we need to bind, we need to bind null, and then we're going to pass in the parameter index. So when you click on the remove button here, it's going to call this function remove item with a specified index. And index is coming from here when we're calling the map function. And so here when you click remove, we can add some functionality here now. So when you click remove, remove on click, we're going to call a function. This props remove item. And that's all. So when you click on this button, it'll call this props remove item, which is a function that exists here. And we pass this function along down to the component. And so now if you click remove, it removes an item from the array. It removes it from the state. And so as you can see, I didn't have to write any code for the DOM rendering. It just does it automatically. When you change the state, here, we're changing the state, it automatically calls this render function again, and it efficiently determines what elements need to change. And now we'll also add some functionality for this finished. Finished will basically just cross off the item. So here we don't have to modify the state for that. So here we can actually just create a function called check item. And we need to somehow change, so we're going to check off this whole property. So here we'll call on click this check item. So we don't have to call this props because this function check item exists here. In this case, we have to call this props remove item because remove item was being passed as a property, as you can see here. So check item will basically text equals the event, so e target parent node. So when we click on a button, we're going to get the parent node, which will be this is the parent node. And then we want the first span. We're going to get this span, and we're just going to add a CSS property, which does a line through. You'll see in a second. So get elements by tag name, span, and we'll get the first one. And so now we'll do text class list add. Actually, if it contains the class list line. If it does, then we will remove it. Otherwise, we will add it. And so now if we reload this, so now if you click this finished button, it puts a line through the item, which is pretty cool. You can still remove it. You can uncheck it, so finished, you can uncross it off, finished. And so the way this works is when you click this item, it calls check item, and then this basically takes the event that you click, the button you clicked, gets the target parent node, which is this whole node, and then it gets the first span element, and then it basically just adds the class line if it exists, otherwise it removes it. And the class line exists in the CSS file. You can see right here. It just adds a line through it. So it's not actually modifying the state, it's just modifying the way it looks. Okay, and so now one more thing we'll need to do. So we almost have a functioning to-do app. We just need to be able to add elements. So right now we can remove elements by modifying the state and then make it look pretty cool by crossing it off. So now we need to add items. So now we need to modify the functionality within to-do input. Basically what we want is when you click submit, it'll take what you entered and change the state here. So as you would have, as you might have guessed, we need to add a function here called add item, which will modify the state. So add item will take an item, and then what we're going to do now is modify the state. So we're going to take the item that was passed in, add it to the current state, and then set the state to that new array. So we'll do the same as we did in remove item. So var a equals this state items. And the reason we're creating a new array is because you're not supposed to directly modify the state in React. You're supposed to call the set state function. So this state items, and now we're going to concatenate it with a new array, and we'll basically so when we add an item, we'll need to add an ID. And the reason we're adding this ID is because here we need to uniquely identify each to-do item component. So I'll leave that blank for a second. ID, so I remember. And then we'll just set the text to item. So basically we're being passed in an item, which will be the text. And we're creating a new array. We're taking what exists in the state and adding in a new object. So we're adding in a new object. The ID I'll explain in a second. And then the text will just be the item being passed in. And then we'll just do the same thing we did before. This set state. And then items is A. So the thing with the counter is, so the ID, what we want is to maintain some sort of counter so that we can always uniquely identify an item. So when we add an item, the counter, which for example here, we have 3 items. The counter will be 4. So when you add a new item, the ID will be 4. If you add another item, the ID will be 5. And then even if you start removing elements, and for example, there's only 1 element in the to-do app, next time you add an item, the ID will be 6. This way it's always unique and you don't have to worry about duplicate elements. So the way we'll do that is when you call getInitialState, we actually also want to set some sort of counter. So we'll set, counter actually, so if we don't pass in any elements here, we want counter to be 0. Otherwise we want it to be the length of this array. So getInitialState, and we'll create a variable called counter. And basically what it does is this props items. So if there are some items, then counter will be this props.items length plus 1. Otherwise, we just set it to 1. So if there are no elements being passed in to this app and the app is initially empty, then counter is set at 1. Otherwise, it's the length of the elements being passed in plus 1. And so now here, items is this props items or the empty array, and then counter is counter. I forgot to mention this part before, so if you don't pass in any items here, we just want to set items to be the default value of an empty array. And then counter will be either 1 or the length of the elements. And so now ID is counter. When you add a new item, the ID will be set to counter, but we also want to increase counter. So we're setting this state items, and we want to modify counter. So we just set counter equal to this state counter plus 1. So now when you add an item, the counter increases. So first the item is added to the state. The state is updated. So items will be this new state with the new item added in, and then we update the counter. So next time we add an item, the counter will be incremented by 1. So now we just need to add this. We need to take this function and somehow pass it down to this component here, so we can use it. So what we'll do is this to-do input, as we did with this list item here, we passed in the function. We'll do the same thing. We'll just pass in add item equal this add item. So we're basically passing in this function to this component here. So now we can access it within its properties here. Okay, so now the to-do input, we'll do the same thing we did for to-do item. When you click on it, we want to call a function. So on the submit, we'll do on click equals this handle submit. So what we want to do is before we pass in the text you just wrote, we want to pass it through some intermediary function to strip some elements or to shorten it or do whatever. So if we enter something like space, 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 dot, we don't actually want all these spaces being entered into this text. So we have some function we create called this handle submit, and then handle submit is a function that's created locally to this component. So before we actually add the item to the state, and then we add the item and then modify the state, we're gonna modify it here. So first we want to check. So the input will be. So we need to somehow get this text now. So what we're going to do is React has this cool property called ref, and basically you can refer to this element by accessing this ref property. So we'll call it input text, and now you can just do this ref's input text. So we basically don't have to do any DOM searching, doing document, get elements by, etc. We can just do this ref's input text. And so now, if the input is not blank, so the input gets this DOM element. So what we actually want is this value. And then we will call the trim function, which will remove spaces before and after the text. So if the text is okay, this props add item. So we passed in add item right here. Add item passes in this function add item, and we can access it via this props. So if the text is okay, we're going to pass in the item, and we're just going to pass in the text we just wrote. So imp value trim, and then also what we'll do is we'll strip it. So we'll do 050. So we'll basically, if you enter in a text that's like 500 characters long, we don't actually want that whole thing. We'll just strip it to 50 characters. And this is just an easy way to get around the problem of the text overflowing for now. In reality, you can maybe show a small section of the text, and then when you click on it, it expands it and shows you all of it. So yeah, so it calls the function, and then we just reset the value to nothing. And so now if we run this, so to do something. Whoops, we got an error. Let's see if we've forgotten something. Counter, oh, counter is not defined. Okay, so counter, mistake campus run. Oh, right here, okay. So I made a mistake here, so this should be this state counter. So the counter is a local variable here, but we actually want to get this state. Okay, so now if we run it, do something, and it works. Okay, so, and so you can see here also, just like for remove item, we're not doing any DOM manipulation. What I'm doing is when you click the button, it basically takes the value you entered and calls a function, add item. Add item here changes the state by adding in this new value, updates the state, and then it just calls this, then it re-renders the whole component. and it re-renders only the parts that need to be re-rendered. So it does that efficiently. So we can say do something hello world, and we can just continuously add ABC, and now we can mark some of them as finished. We can remove some elements, ABC, and so you can see the beauty of React is that all we have to do is update the state and modify the data, and then it takes care of the DOM rendering for us. And so this is, a really simple to-do application. All we have to do is create a few components, add some events for adding and removing elements, and then we have a working to-do app. It was really simple to do this, and it didn't require too much JavaScript.